The train doors slammed shut with a metallic echo that seemed to swallow the last breath of freedom. Inside the crowded carriage, dozens of terrified women stood shoulder to shoulder, their eyes wide with confusion and dread. Somewhere in the distance, soldiers shouted orders while the wheels began to grind slowly forward. No one told them where they were going. No one told them what awaited them. But in that moment, deep in the darkness of wartime Europe, a silent truth began to unfold, one that history would struggle to speak about for decades. Because the suffering of women during the war that consumed the world was far greater, far darker, and far more complicated than most history books ever revealed. When people think about the horrors of the war that erupted in 1939, they often imagine soldiers charging across battlefields, tanks rolling through cities, and fighter planes screaming through the sky. They remember the famous generals, the political speeches, and the dramatic turning points that reshaped nations. But behind those headlines lived millions of women whose stories rarely appeared in official reports. Women who endured occupations, starvation, forced labor, imprisonment, and unspeakable violence. Women who held families together while entire societies collapsed around them. And women who became silent victims of one of the darkest chapters in human history. The war began with the thunder of invasion. On September 1st, 1939, German forces launched a massive attack on Poland, unleashing the conflict that would soon engulf continents. Cities were bombed, borders vanished overnight, governments collapsed in days. For soldiers, the war meant fighting on the front lines. But for civilians, especially women, the war brought a different kind of battlefield, one that existed inside homes, streets, factories, and prison camps. At first, many believed the conflict would be short. Leaders across Europe spoke confidently about quick victories and decisive campaigns. But the reality that followed was something entirely different. As the war spread across Europe and beyond, entire societies were transformed. Millions of men were sent to fight. Factories shifted to producing weapons. Cities prepared for air raids. Governments imposed strict controls over daily life. And women suddenly found themselves carrying responsibilities that had once belonged to entire communities. In Britain, women stepped into factories that produced aircraft, tanks, and ammunition. In the Soviet Union, women worked tirelessly in farms and industrial plants while millions of soldiers fought on the Eastern Front. In the United States, women became symbols of wartime production, proving that the strength of a nation did not come only from its soldiers. But behind these stories of resilience and patriotism lay darker realities. In occupied territories, women faced dangers that had nothing to do with factory work or national pride. They lived under the rule of armies that controlled every aspect of their lives. And sometimes those armies treated them not as citizens, but as spoils of war. When German forces occupied large parts of Europe, women in countries like Poland, France, and the Netherlands quickly realized how fragile their safety had become. Soldiers patrolled streets. Curfews restricted movement. Food became scarce, and every knock on the door could bring fear. Some women joined resistance movements, risking their lives to smuggle information, hide fugitives, or sabotage enemy operations. These acts required enormous courage, but resistance also brought brutal consequences. If resistance members were captured, punishment could be swift and merciless. Entire families were arrested. Villages were destroyed, and women suspected of aiding resistance fighters often faced interrogation, imprisonment, or worse. Yet the suffering of women during the war did not happen only in occupied Europe. Across the globe, the war created circumstances where millions of women became vulnerable to exploitation. In parts of Asia, the expansion of the Japanese military brought devastating consequences for local populations. Women were forced into systems that historians would later describe as one of the most disturbing forms of wartime abuse. Many were taken from their homes and forced to work in military facilities where their lives were controlled by occupying forces. For decades after the war ended, many survivors remained silent about what they had experienced. Cultural stigma and fear prevented them from speaking openly. But their stories eventually began to surface, and they revealed how deeply the war had scarred entire generations. Meanwhile, in Europe, the machinery of persecution was expanding. One of the most terrifying aspects of the war was the creation of massive prison camp systems designed to control and eliminate populations considered undesirable by the Nazi regime. Women were among the millions who were deported to these camps. Some camps were built specifically for female prisoners. One of the most notorious was Ravensbrück concentration camp. Located in northern Germany, Ravensbrück became the largest concentration camp designed primarily for women. Prisoners arrived from across Europe, political dissidents, resistance members, Jews, Roma, and countless others who had been labeled enemies of the regime. Inside the camp, life was defined by constant fear. Prisoners endured exhausting labor, starvation rations, brutal discipline, and overcrowded barracks. Many were forced to work in factories that supported the German war effort. Others became subjects of horrific medical experiments. Doctors working under the Nazi system performed procedures on prisoners without consent, often causing permanent injuries or death. Survivors later described the agony of these experiments and the terrifying uncertainty that accompanied every medical inspection. Yet even in such conditions, moments of courage and humanity emerged. Women secretly shared food, cared for sick prisoners, and protected younger inmates when possible. These small acts of solidarity became lifelines in an environment designed to destroy hope. Far away from these camps, millions of women were fighting a different battle, the battle to survive daily life during total war. Cities across Europe and Asia were targeted by devastating bombing campaigns. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble overnight. Families hid in basements and shelters while explosions shook the ground above them. In cities like London, Berlin, and Tokyo, women often carried the responsibility of protecting children while air raids raged overhead. They learned to read the warning sirens, gather emergency supplies, and rush to shelters within minutes. Sometimes the shelters survived, sometimes they did not, and every morning brought the same haunting question: who was still alive? As the war dragged on, shortages grew worse. Food rationing forced families to survive on limited supplies. Long lines formed outside shops. Women traded goods on black markets, repaired clothing again and again, and searched desperately for ways to feed their families. But the war was about to reach its most devastating phase. By 1944 and 1945, the conflict had consumed nearly every corner of Europe. The Eastern Front between Germany and the Soviet Union had become one of the most brutal battle zones in history. Entire cities had been destroyed, millions of soldiers had died, and as Soviet forces began pushing westward toward Germany, another tragedy began unfolding, one that would remain deeply controversial and painful for decades. In the final months of the war, countless German civilians fled their homes to escape the advancing front lines. Women and children formed enormous columns of refugees moving through frozen landscapes, carrying whatever belongings they could manage. Fear traveled with them, because they knew what often happened when armies reached defenseless populations. And soon, the war would reveal yet another dark truth about the suffering of women. A truth that would remain hidden in silence for generations. The winter wind cut across the ruined roads like a blade as endless columns of refugees moved slowly through the shattered landscape of Central Europe. Mothers pulled children through snow that had turned grey with ash. Old carts creaked under the weight of the few belongings families had managed to save before fleeing their homes. Behind them, distant artillery thundered like an approaching storm. By early 1945, the war in Europe had entered its final and most chaotic phase. The German army was collapsing under the immense pressure of advancing Allied forces from the west and the Soviet army from the east. Cities that had once symbolized the power of the German Reich were now crumbling ruins filled with smoke, broken glass, and terrified civilians. Among those civilians were millions of women. For years they had endured bombings, rationing, and constant fear. Now they faced something even more terrifying: the collapse of the entire society around them. As Soviet troops advanced deeper into German territory, panic spread rapidly across towns and villages. Many civilians attempted to flee before the front lines arrived. Long columns of refugees stretched across roads, hoping to escape the fighting. But escape was often impossible. Railways had been destroyed, fuel was scarce. Entire regions were already surrounded by armies, and when soldiers finally entered these cities and villages, the consequences for many women were devastating. Historians still struggle to fully measure the scale of the violence that occurred during these final months of the war. In the chaos of collapsing governments, destroyed infrastructure, and massive population movements, countless crimes went unrecorded. Yet survivor testimonies and later research revealed that large numbers of women across Central and Eastern Europe experienced terrible abuse during the final stages of the conflict. The stories that eventually emerged painted a deeply disturbing picture. Women hiding in basements as soldiers searched buildings, families desperately trying to protect daughters and sisters, communities living in constant fear of the next knock on the door. Many survivors would later describe these months as a period when the normal rules of society seemed to disappear entirely. But the suffering of women during the war did not begin or end with the collapse of Germany. Across the continent, women had been enduring violence, displacement, and exploitation since the very beginning of the conflict. In occupied territories, women often found themselves caught between multiple dangers. Some were suspected of helping resistance movements. Others were accused of cooperating with occupying forces. Either accusation could lead to punishment. Sometimes that punishment came from the occupying authorities. Sometimes it came from their own communities. In France, for example, the end of the war brought a wave of public revenge against women accused of having relationships with German soldiers. These women were dragged into public squares where crowds cut their hair, marked them as traitors, and humiliated them in front of entire towns. For many of these women, the truth behind the accusations was far more complicated than the crowd understood. Some relationships had been forced by survival. Others were acts of desperation during years of occupation. But in the emotional aftermath of liberation, few people were willing to consider these complexities. The war had created wounds that demanded someone to blame. Meanwhile, in the vast territories of the Soviet Union, women had faced another kind of struggle entirely. When Germany invaded in 1941, the Soviet Union mobilized nearly every part of its population for survival. Millions of women stepped into roles that had once been reserved for men. They worked in factories producing tanks and artillery. They operated tractors on farms that fed the army. They repaired railways and built fortifications. And some of them did something that shocked even their own commanders. They became soldiers. Soviet women served in a wide range of military roles during the war. They worked as medics, pilots, snipers, and communications specialists. One of the most famous groups was a regiment of female night bomber pilots who flew dangerous missions against German targets. Flying outdated aircraft in darkness, these pilots approached enemy positions with engines cut to reduce noise, gliding silently before releasing their bombs. German soldiers reportedly feared these nighttime attacks so much that they gave the pilots a chilling nickname. They called them the Night Witches. These women demonstrated extraordinary bravery, flying hundreds of missions despite constant danger from anti-aircraft fire and enemy fighters. But even their heroism could not erase the immense suffering experienced by millions of other women throughout the war. Because while some women fought on the front lines, countless others fought simply to survive. In occupied Eastern Europe, entire communities were uprooted and deported. Women were taken from their homes and transported to labor camps where they were forced to work in factories, farms, and construction sites under brutal conditions. Some were sent to the massive camp systems operated by Nazi Germany. One of the most notorious of these camps remained the women's camp at Ravensbrück concentration camp. At Ravensbrück, prisoners lived in overcrowded barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Every day began before sunrise with roll calls that could last for hours in freezing weather. Food rations were minimal. Illness spread rapidly. Yet even within this nightmare, acts of resistance and solidarity continued. Prisoners secretly organized networks to share information, protect weaker inmates, and document what was happening inside the camp. Some women risked their lives smuggling notes and reports to the outside world whenever possible. They understood that if no one recorded these crimes, the truth might disappear forever. And for a long time after the war, that fear seemed justified, because when the war finally ended in 1945, the world's attention turned quickly toward rebuilding nations, prosecuting major war criminals, and beginning the long process of recovery. Many stories of suffering remained buried. Women who had survived imprisonment, forced labor, or wartime violence often returned home to communities that struggled to understand what they had endured. Some survivors chose silence because the memories were too painful. Others feared judgment or rejection. In many cultures, discussing such experiences openly was considered shameful. So for decades, countless women carried these memories alone. But history has a way of slowly uncovering truths that were once hidden. As researchers, historians, and survivors began documenting personal testimonies in the decades after the war, a clearer picture of women's experiences during the conflict began to emerge, and it revealed that women had been affected by the war in ways that traditional histories had rarely acknowledged. They were not simply passive victims waiting for liberation. They were workers, resistance fighters, soldiers, prisoners, refugees, and survivors. They were individuals whose lives had been permanently altered by one of the most destructive conflicts in human history. And their stories were far from finished, because even after the guns fell silent and the armies returned home, the war continued to shape the lives of millions of women for decades. Trauma lingered. Families searched for missing relatives. Communities struggled to rebuild trust after years of fear and betrayal. The war had ended, but its shadows remained, and the true scale of what women had suffered was only beginning to be understood. In the spring of 1945, As the guns finally began to fall silent across Europe, a strange and uneasy quiet settled over cities that had once been battlefields. Smoke still drifted above broken buildings. Streets were filled with rubble where homes had once stood. Trains arrived at stations carrying prisoners who had survived camps that the world had barely known existed. For many women, the end of the war did not feel like victory. It felt like the beginning of another struggle. Because survival did not erase what they had endured. Across Europe and Asia, millions of women returned from forced labor camps, prisons, and war zones to homes that no longer existed. Some arrived to find their entire families gone. Others discovered that the communities they once knew had been shattered by years of occupation and violence. In many cases, the world they returned to had no place for their stories. Some women had been prisoners in Nazi camps, such as Ravensbrück concentration camp, where they endured starvation, brutal labor, and constant fear. When liberation finally came in 1945, survivors were often weak, sick, and traumatized. Many could barely speak about what they had witnessed. Medical teams and relief organizations struggled to provide care for thousands of former prisoners. Hospitals filled with survivors suffering from malnutrition, disease, and long-term injuries caused by years of abuse. But physical wounds were only part of the damage. Psychological trauma lingered long after liberation. Nightmares, anxiety, and deep emotional scars followed many survivors for the rest of their lives. At the time, very little was understood about trauma. Psychological support systems that exist today were almost non-existent in the immediate aftermath of the war. So many women were simply expected to move on, to rebuild their lives, to remain silent about what had happened. In some places, silence became a survival strategy. Women who had experienced violence during the war often feared judgment from their own communities. In conservative societies, victims sometimes worried they would be blamed or rejected if they spoke openly about what had happened. As a result, countless stories remained hidden within families for decades, but the war had also transformed women's roles in society in ways that could not easily be reversed. During the conflict, women had stepped into jobs that had previously been reserved almost entirely for men. They worked in factories, managed farms, drove trucks, repaired machinery, and operated complex industrial equipment. These contributions had helped sustain entire nations during the war. Yet when soldiers returned home, many governments encouraged women to leave those jobs and return to traditional domestic roles. Propaganda campaigns urged women to focus on rebuilding families and raising children. In some industries, women were quietly pushed aside to make room for returning veterans. But the experience of wartime work had changed how many women viewed themselves. They had proven that they could perform demanding industrial labor, manage businesses, and take on responsibilities once considered impossible for them. That realization would slowly influence social movements in the decades that followed. Meanwhile, the political map of the world was also shifting dramatically. Countries devastated by the war began rebuilding under new political systems. In Eastern Europe, Soviet influence created communist governments that reshaped entire societies. In Western Europe, democratic institutions were gradually restored, and in both systems, women's roles continued evolving. In the Soviet Union and other socialist states, governments promoted female participation in the workforce as part of their ideology of equality. Women worked as engineers, doctors, scientists, and factory workers. In Western Europe and North America, the memory of women's wartime contributions helped fuel new conversations about gender equality, employment rights, and education. But these changes did not happen overnight. Progress came slowly, often through long struggles for recognition and fairness. And throughout those decades of change, the memories of the war remained powerful. For many survivors, the past was never truly gone. Women who had lived through occupation remembered the fear of soldiers marching through their streets. Former prisoners remembered the barbed wire and watchtowers that surrounded their barracks. Mothers who had protected children during air raids remembered the deafening sound of bombs falling from the sky. Those memories became part of family histories passed down to later generations. Sometimes they were shared openly. Sometimes they remained unspoken. But gradually, historians and researchers began collecting testimonies from survivors, realizing that traditional histories of the war had overlooked many of these personal experiences. For decades, historical accounts had focused primarily on military strategy, political leaders, and major battles. Yet the war had also been fought inside homes, villages, factories, and prison camps, and women had been at the center of those struggles. Their stories revealed how civilians endured hunger, displacement, and fear while armies fought across continents. They showed how communities survived occupation and resistance, and they exposed the darker realities of wartime violence that had once been hidden behind silence. These testimonies changed how historians understood the war. They demonstrated that the conflict was not only a clash of armies or ideologies. It was also a human catastrophe that reached deeply into the lives of ordinary people, especially women. Because women had experienced the war in multiple roles simultaneously. They were caregivers protecting families, workers sustaining national economies, resistance fighters risking their lives for freedom, prisoners surviving unimaginable cruelty, and survivors rebuilding lives from ruins. Their resilience helped shape the post-war world. As societies slowly recovered from destruction, women continued contributing to rebuilding cities, restoring economies, and creating new opportunities for future generations. Many became teachers, nurses, community leaders, and activists dedicated to preventing the kind of destruction they had witnessed. Their experiences also influenced the development of international human rights movements. The horrors of the war, including the suffering of civilians and prisoners, led to new global agreements intended to protect human dignity during conflicts. International laws addressing war crimes, crimes against humanity, and the treatment of civilians were strengthened in the years that followed. These efforts were attempts to ensure that the darkest chapters of the war would never be repeated. Whether humanity has fully succeeded in that goal remains a question history continues to ask. But one thing is certain: the stories of women who endured the war remind us that history is not only shaped by generals, presidents, or battlefield victories. It is shaped by ordinary people who survive extraordinary circumstances. People whose courage often remains invisible in official records. People whose sacrifices quietly influence the course of generations. When we look back at the war today, we see maps of battles, photographs of destroyed cities, and speeches delivered by powerful leaders. Yet behind every one of those images were millions of women facing choices that required incredible strength. Some protected families in bomb shelters. Some carried messages for resistance fighters. Some endured imprisonment in camps surrounded by barbed wire. Some rebuilt homes from rubble after everything had been lost. Their experiences reveal a deeper truth about the nature of war. War is never confined to battlefields. It spreads into homes, communities, and private lives. It reshapes entire societies, and the people who endure its consequences are often those whose names rarely appear in history books. That is why remembering their stories matters, because history is not only about what happened, it is also about whose voices are heard. For decades, many women who lived through the war believed their experiences would never be recognized. But today their voices are finally becoming part of the historical record. Their testimonies remind us that survival itself can be an act of extraordinary courage, and that even in the darkest chapters of human history, resilience can endure. The war that began with invasion and destruction eventually ended with rebuilding and reflection. Yet its legacy continues shaping our understanding of the past, and the stories of the women who lived through it ensure that the human cost of war will never be forgotten.